Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Before we start today's episode, I have an item of housekeeping. More specifically, a correction I need to make. Last time, I mistakenly said that the wife of the traitor Corfitz Ulfeldt, the half-sister of King Frederik III, was called Christiane. That wasn't her name at all. Corfitz Ulfeldt's wife was called Leonora Christina and nothing else. Leonora Christina had a sister called Christiane, and she was married to Hannibal Seystedt, the governor of Norway. Besides mixing up the names of Christian IV's daughters, last time I also spoke about King Frederik III's attempt to get revenge and restore the honor of the crown. He was fairly successful when it came to his in-laws, not least Leonora Christina's and Christiane's husbands, but his attempt to get back at Sweden and reclaim territory and honor lost in the Torstensson War backfired spectacularly. Thanks to the cold winter weather, King Karl X Gustav of Sweden managed to march across the ice between the Danish islands and reached all the way to the outskirts of Copenhagen. The Swedes only stopped their advance when King Frederik offered an unconditional surrender. In the peace negotiations that followed, Denmark had to relinquish all the lands east of the Øresund Strait, the province of Trondheim in Norway, as well as a number of smaller possessions on the continent. The war had been a disaster for Denmark and for its king. Today, we'll look at how Frederik III handled the fallout of this catastrophic conflict. Episode 97, Absolut Denmark. Last time, I mentioned that the traitor Corfitz Ulfeldt participated in the Swedish negotiating team in Roskilde that ended the war in February 1658. As always, Ulfeldt made sure his own interests were taken care of, so King Frederik III of Denmark didn't just have to hand over Trondheim, Bohuslän, Halland, Scania, Blekinge and Bornholm to Sweden, he also had to give back all the property the crown had confiscated from Corfitz Ulfeldt and his wife when they left for Sweden. That must have been a sweet moment for Ulfeldt, but on the other hand, it didn't take long for the arrogant Dane to fall out with the Swedish king as well, and he was soon forced into double exile, where he eventually died in 1664. His wife, who we now all know was called Leonora Christina and nothing else, returned to Denmark, where she was imprisoned in the Blue Tower at Copenhagen Castle for 22 years. After her husband's death in 1664, she wasn't a threat to her half-brother Frederik III anymore, but Queen Sophia Amalia wanted revenge for the humiliating treatment she and Frederik had suffered back when the Ulfeldts had been the most powerful couple in Denmark. So she demanded that Leonora Christina remain in prison. The king's half-sister was only released after the queen died in 1685 and was allowed to live out her life in a country estate far from events in the capital. She took her revenge on the dead queen by writing a bitter and self-serving memoir. To the extent that people have an opinion about Sophia Amalia today, it's more likely than not that it's colored by her rival's poisonous pen. By the way, if we're already tying up loose ends in the Danish royal family, it may be worth pointing out that Leonora Christina's mother, Kirsten Munk, who was Christian IV's second wife, kept supporting her daughter and her husband Corfitz Ulfeldt even after they were condemned as traitors and ran off to Sweden. Obviously, this meant that her relationship with King Frederik III was rather frosty. Kirsten Munk died in 1658, when most of Denmark was under Swedish occupation, and she was buried in a splendid state funeral in Odense Cathedral by the Ulfeldts. An honor the King of Denmark most certainly wouldn't have granted her if he'd been in control of his own kingdom at the time. Anyway, after everything I talked about last time, I don't think it'll come as much of a surprise to you or anyone else that Frederik III was far from happy about the Roskilde peace agreement that he'd been forced to sign in February 1658. Perhaps you'll be more surprised to learn that the King of Sweden, Karl Gustav, wasn't happy about it either. He felt cheated and thought the Danes had received a way too good deal. But he had been forced to sign a quick deal because the war on the continent was still going on, and his focus was now on the continued fighting against Poland, Russia, Brandenburg, and the Holy Roman Empire. But then things changed. First of all, the German principalities were far less interested in joining a Swedish attack on the emperor than Karl Gustav had hoped and, quite frankly, needed. I guess they didn't want to start yet another ruinous war in the empire when they had just managed to finish the 30 Years' War. An additional problem was that even though the French were pushing the Swedes to attack the Habsburgs, they weren't willing to put up any money to pay for the new war. And without both allies and funding, an attack on the Holy Roman Empire was out of the question for the moment. So despite Karl Gustav's best efforts, it seemed like peace was around the corner, since the war in Denmark was over and the outlook for renewed fighting on the continent was bad. Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. At this point in time, after years and years of constant fighting on the continent, Sweden had a large army of veteran mercenaries, and it was far from risk-free or cheap to tell them that their services were no longer needed and they should all just go home. It was equally dangerous to just let them stay idle where they were. That was basically asking for trouble. The best option would be to let them do their thing, that is, fighting. And Karl Gustav had the perfect new conflict in mind. Since he wasn't happy about the far too lenient peace the Danes had received in Roskilde, he decided to restart the war against Denmark again. The official justification was that the Danes weren't as compliant as the King of Sweden wanted when it came to fulfilling all the conditions of the peace agreement. But that was just an excuse. Karl Gustav wanted to take this opportunity to wipe Denmark off the map once and for all and unite all of Scandinavia under the Swedish crown. Karl Gustav thought it should be easy enough. Swedish armies already controlled Jutland and Funen. Now all they needed to do was to capture Zealand. In August 1658, the king ordered the attack. The goal? Capturing Copenhagen. The Swedish army reached the outskirts of the Danish capital on August 11th. At the same time, a Swedish fleet of 28 ships blocked the harbor, making sure no supplies would reach the city. But the Danes had had time to prepare, and the king had ordered that all the buildings outside the city walls were to be burnt to the ground, even though that meant that no less than 1/3 of the city's inhabitants became homeless overnight. On that same day, the city gates were closed and barricaded. As he looked out of the smoldering suburbs, the King of Sweden realized that the people of Copenhagen were serious about defending their city. That meant that King Karl Gustav had to make a decision. Should he attack right away, or should he besiege Copenhagen, starving it to submission? The members of his Council of War couldn't agree, and in the end, the king decided to go for a siege. In hindsight, that was probably a mistake. The Danish defenses were far less formidable than what they seemed as the smoke billowed from the burning suburbs. But thanks to the Swedish decision not to attack immediately, the Danes had time to improve and strengthen the city's defenses. Cannons were also brought up from ships anchored in the harbor. These guns were distributed along the walls to increase the defensive firepower. The Danes also organized several counterattacks, such as the one on August 23rd, when almost 3,000 men, not only soldiers but also sailors and students, conducted a surprise raid on the Swedes through a hidden sally port in the city walls. They destroyed some fortifications the Swedes were building, and they captured 3 cannons. But beyond that, the main effect of the raid was to raise the morale of the besieged burghers. And they needed every morale boost they could get. The Swedes had easily captured Christian IV's dilapidated outer defenses and had placed their cannons and howitzers there, pointing at the city. Throughout the siege, these guns bombarded Copenhagen with over 200 rounds per day, adding the fear of Swedish fire to the growing worry over food to the daily experience of the civilians trapped in the city. Even though the situation for the people of Copenhagen was far from ideal, they weren't ready to give up hope just yet. And that wasn't only because a bunch of students and soldiers managed to tear down some scaffolding and steal a couple of cannons. No, the Danes locked up in Copenhagen were hoping the Dutch would come to their rescue, restoring the balance of power in Scandinavia by pushing back the Swedes. The Swedes were also expecting a Dutch intervention. To block that possibility, they decided that they needed to capture Kronborg Castle. Kronborg is situated just outside the town of Helsingør, at the most narrow point of the Øresund Strait. From Kronborg Castle, it's only 4 kilometers across Toscania on the eastern shore. listeners who've been paying attention may remember the name Kronborg Castle, because this was the place where vessels passing in and out of the Baltic Sea had to pay the Øresund toll to the Danish crown. King Frederik III also realized the supreme strategic importance of Kronborg Castle and its key role to let a Dutch relief force into the Baltic Sea, so he ordered the commander of the castle to hold it at any price. If the castle would fall, he was to blow up Kronborg to make sure it wouldn't fall into Swedish hands. Already on August 16th, so less than a week after they reached Copenhagen, the Swedes arrived at Elsinore and started to bombard Kronborg from the town. Despite fierce Danish resistance, the Swedes managed to capture the outer defensive line. Still, the castle was far from taken, and the inner line of defense was formidable. So instead of sacrificing soldiers on what would have been a bloody and quite possibly unsuccessful assault, the Swedish commander decided to try to take the castle with a trick instead. He spread the rumor that Copenhagen had capitulated and opened its gates to the Swedes. The war was over and Denmark had lost. He even had the Swedish soldiers stage a fake victory party below the walls of Kronborg. And it worked. The defenders of Kronborg thought the war was lost and just gave up. The Swedes quickly occupied the castle, and by the time the Danes realized they'd been tricked, it was too late. But despite the successful takeover of Kronborg Castle, the Dutch managed to push past its 77 cannons and sailed down the Øresund Strait toward Copenhagen with a fleet of no fewer than 45 ships. They did so by sailing daringly close to the Scanian coast and therefore passing out of range of the cannons of Kronborg. Not even a Swedish force of 43 ships sent to block the Dutch advance managed to stop them. Instead, the defeated Swedes had to seek refuge in the harbour at Landskrona on the Scanian shore of the Øresund. The Dutch then quickly established a naval blockade of the harbour, effectively locking up the Swedish fleet. The arrival of the Dutch was excellent news for King Frederick. After 6 months of siege, Copenhagen could finally be reached via the sea again, and the defenders could be supplied with provisions and weapons needed to keep up the fight. Meanwhile, outside the city walls, the King of Sweden realized the siege had failed. If he didn't want to sue for peace now, under far worse conditions than in Roskilde, he had to act fast. He had to take the Danish capital by storm immediately. If he didn't, he risked losing not only the war, but everything he'd achieved by marching across the frozen sea the year before. Since that wasn't an option as far as Karl Gustav was concerned, he ordered a full-scale attack on Copenhagen. Taking the capital and capturing King Frederick himself would not only put an end to the war, but to Denmark itself. But it wasn't going to be easy. The Danes had drawn the same conclusion and were expecting a Swedish assault. 6,000 soldiers and 5,000 civilian men and women spent a few frantic days and nights beefing up the city's defenses. The Swedes attacked in the night of February 9th, but that, and the attack the following night, were only minor diversions undertaken to confuse and tire the defenders. The real assault came at midnight on February 11th, 1659. The Swedes attacked from 2 directions at once, from the south and the north. Karl Gustav personally led the southern troops. They were met with precise and effective fire from 100 cannons. Despite this, the Swedes advanced and reached the outer palisades that the Danes had constructed on the frozen sea surrounding the city. The Swedes easily forced their way past the palisades, but on the other side they ran into moats that the defenders had cut up in the ice. The Swedes had expected this and brought forward makeshift bridges, but the first ones were too short. Nonetheless, they held their positions under heavy fire as longer bridges were eventually brought to the front line, and the Swedes could move on to the city walls themselves. But here the advance faltered, and despite ferocious efforts to breach the walls, the Swedes were pushed back and had to retreat. Meanwhile, the troops attacking from the north reached the moat close to the fortress Kastellet, but they walked straight into an ambush, and after sustaining many casualties, they, too, had no choice but to retreat. At about 6 o'clock in the morning, King Karl Gustav knew that the assault had failed, and he ordered a general retreat. This was bad. The king had wagered everything on a successful storm of the city, and his forces had been repelled. The chances of taking Copenhagen now looked slimmer than ever. And that wasn't the only bad news for the Swedes. When Karl Gustav had reignited the war, the old anti-Swedish coalition had also swung back into action again, and imperial troops, joined by forces from Brandenburg and Poland, had first invaded the poorly defended Swedish positions in Prussia and Pomerania. And if that wasn't bad enough, they'd continued to push into Jutland. Now they were following in Karl Gustav's own footsteps from 1657, threatening to roll back all the Swedish gains. On May 19th, the Allies had captured the fortress of Frederiksodde from the Swedes, who then had retreated across the Little Belt Strait to the island of Funen. That summer, the Allies launched 3 attacks on the island, but the Swedes managed to repel them every time. That may have stopped their further advance, but it also meant that the remaining Swedish troops were now stuck on the Danish central islands, while the Danes and the Dutch controlled the waterways. That same summer, the Dutch and the English made a formal agreement stating that no one power would be allowed to completely control the Baltic Sea. That was bad news for both Swedish and Danish ambitions in the long term, but at the moment it was a godsend for the Swedes, because that meant the English stepped in to make sure the Dutch didn't let the Danes push their advantage against the Swedes too far. Instead, the Danes were forced, or at least strongly encouraged, to sit down at the negotiating table. Despite his preference for a military solution in every situation that offered one, even King Karl Gustav understood that this time he could no longer win on the battlefield. He offered to negotiate with both Denmark and Poland, but at the same time he refused to agree to any territorial concessions whatsoever. Since that meant that the peace negotiations might very well fail, he also needed to prepare the army and the fleet for continued fighting. And that, in turn, meant he needed more money. So Karl Gustav called for a meeting of the Riksdag in Gothenburg after the new year in 1660. The king wanted the estates to agree to his hard line and to approve additional funds if the war had to go on to achieve the king's military aims. It was going to be a tough sell, but in the end, Karl Gustav didn't have to figure out a way to get the Riksdag to agree to his proposal, because in the beginning of February he caught pneumonia, and after only a few days he succumbed to the illness and died in the night between February 12th and 13th, 1660. The death of Karl X Gustav of Sweden meant that one of the major obstacles to a quick peace deal was removed. Already in April, the new Swedish Regency government, ruling in the name of Karl Gustav's 5-year-old son, Karl, signed a peace deal with Poland-Lithuania, Brandenburg, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Danes, on the other hand, proved to be a tougher nut to crack. They wanted to press home their advantage after Karl Gustav's failed Second War. Both sides called on the larger protectors, the Dutch for the Danes and England and France for the Swedes. For a while, a major Northern European war was looming on the horizon, but in the end, the Swedes and the Danes decided it wasn't worth it for either of them to take the chance. To the general surprise of everyone involved, the two sides sat down to negotiate, and in only a few weeks in May 1660, they managed to agree to only minor adjustments to the Roskilde agreement. In the Treaty of Copenhagen, the Swedes had to return the region around Trondheim, reuniting Norway again. The Danes also got the island of Bornholm back, but in return they had to give the Swedes the smaller island of Ven in the Øresund Strait. In other words, the Treaty of 1660 established the borders between Denmark and Sweden that still exist today. Even though the Danes managed to reclaim some of the territory lost in 1658, the kingdom was still in bad shape after the last 3 years of war against Sweden. In August 1660, a few months after the Treaty of Copenhagen had been signed, King Frederik III called the Danish estates to meet and to agree on a way for Denmark to recover from the shock, both politically and financially. The mood leading up to the meeting was gloomy. The last few years had not been good, and quite a lot of people had reasons to be worried about what the estates would have to say about it. The king, as the head of state, was in a vulnerable position, but Frederick managed to navigate the dangerous political sea quite skillfully. The stated goal of the meeting of the estates was to get Denmark back on its feet, and instead of playing defense and trying to justify his decision to declare war on Sweden in 1657, the king went on the offense. He accused the nobles of not having done their duty in the defense of the kingdom during the 2 recent wars against Sweden. The aristocrats had proven to be cowards, and now they were only preoccupied with safeguarding their privileges and tax exemptions instead of helping out in the rehabilitation of Denmark. This kind of egotistical behavior was nothing short of shameful. This approach proved successful, not least since the king himself was popular. Not only was he not blamed for the war, people also saw him as a brave and heroic figure. It's true that Frederik III milked this for all it was worth, but it wasn't like it was completely made up. His new image had some basis in fact. When the Swedes had been approaching Copenhagen in the summer of 1659, people at court urged Frederik III to leave the capital, but he refused. Instead, the king quoted Job in the Bible, saying, "I will die in my nest." The queen, Sophia Amalia, also showed her valor by riding along the defenses, encouraging the troops. Their courage, and the hay that was made of it, meant that the king had retained and even grown his popularity despite the catastrophic war. And Frederik III knew to exploit this popularity. He had a plan. He wanted to do away with the humiliation of a new king having to sign an oath of office, and suggested that Denmark from now on would no longer be an elective kingdom, but instead would become a hereditary monarchy. The clerics and the Third Estate supported the king, and thought a hereditary system would create more stability, removing the element of uncertainty and potential for political shenanigans whenever the king died and a new one was needed. The only ones who objected to this reform were the nobles. They were dead set against it, since this change would undermine their power and influence. They, through the Council of the Realm, would no longer be able to pressure a pretender to the throne to sign away his powers through a restrictive oath of office as a precondition to elect him king. Things were at an impasse, but King Frederik wasn't prepared to give up so easily. To convince the nobility about the wisdom of his proposed constitutional change, he declared a state of emergency. Copenhagen was put under martial law and the city gates were locked. Nobody could get in or out. This made the nobility come around to the king's perspective, and they accepted the principle of a hereditary monarchy, thereby losing their bargaining chip at each future succession. After everyone had agreed, a well-choreographed scene was played out at the castle square in front of the castle in central Copenhagen. There, the people, represented by members of the estates, as well as a few local peasants dressed up in their Sunday best, symbolically handed back the restrictive oath of office Frederik III had been forced to sign when he became king. After he'd been released of those limitations, he was solemnly declared hereditary monarch of Denmark, and everyone celebrated, at least the king and the peasants. The assembled aristocrats had an easier time containing their excitement. The next step was for the estates to agree on a new constitution for this hereditary monarchy they had just established. But despite long and tedious debates and negotiations, they couldn't agree to a draft text. So instead, they handed the issue over to the king. The meeting of the estates was dissolved, and Frederik was tasked with coming up with a constitution for Denmark on his own. And when it was up to Frederik, he decided that he, and he alone, would call the shots from now on. In January 1661, the king published the so-called Absolute and Hereditary Monarchy Act. In it, he granted himself unlimited power as the absolute monarch by the grace of God. The Council of the Realm was now abolished, and future kings would not have to agree to any oaths of office limiting their powers. Some have called this law the baptism certificate of absolutism. Others have called the whole thing a coup d'etat. The king's senior secretary went around collecting all the necessary signatures for the document, and when he did so, he threatened stalwart nobles, saying that he'd report back to the king with what demeanor people signed the law. 4 years later, in 1665, the Absolute and Hereditary Monarchy Act was replaced by the so-called King's Law. This curious document was something as unique as a written constitution for an absolute monarchy. Most rulers with absolute limitless power don't bother to put the details of the limitless nature of their power in print. In fact, as far as I know, this was the only written constitution of an absolute monarchy in Europe. Not only was there no longer anyone to challenge or question the King's Law decreed that the king be revered and considered the most perfect and supreme person on earth by all his subjects, standing above all human laws and having no judge above his person, except God alone. The King's Law also specified that Frederik III's descendants would have the right to the Danish throne for 1,000 generations. So from now on, the king could do pretty much anything, and no one had the right to stop him or even criticize him. There were, however, three limitations on the king's powers. 1. He had to be a Protestant, adhering to the Augsburg Confession of Faith. 2. He must not divide his realm. And 3. He wasn't allowed to give up any of his absolute powers. With the promulgation of the king's law, the firm aristocratic grip over the Danish government that had seemed so strong just a few years ago was now definitely crushed. Naturally, the nobility was upset about this new system of government, but regular Danes didn't really see much difference in their day-to-day life. Many even saw the strengthening of the king's power as a guarantee of royal protection against aristocratic abuses, something people were all too familiar with. And since this turbulent period was actually followed by one of economic growth and stability, Frederik III became even more popular among his subjects. Here, I think it might be worthwhile to point out that this new legal reality didn't only include Denmark, but also the other kingdom, ruled by the Danish king, namely Norway. Even though the process of introducing absolutism had been similar in Norway, it wasn't identical for a technical reason. There was no need to abolish the election of kings in Norway, since it had been a hereditary monarchy since the Middle Ages. By the time the king's law was introduced, Norway had been ruled by the Danish king for almost 300 years, more precisely since the death of Håkon VI in 1380. Over time, the two kingdoms had grown closer together, and even though they were officially equal, in practice, they were anything but. Denmark had always been the stronger, dominant party. Unfortunately for the Norwegians, they couldn't do much about it. As we've seen in past episodes, the Black Death broke Norway, and it lacked a strong enough domestic nobility to challenge the Danes. The Norwegian weakness relative to Denmark was further accentuated when the semi-independent Catholic hierarchy also lost its position after the Reformation, and the crown took control over the local church. When the Reformation swept away Latin as the liturgical language, local vernaculars were usually strengthened and standardized. We've talked about this before, but in Norway, Christian IV's translation of the Bible into Danish had a strong influence also on Norwegian, both in terms of spelling and vocabulary. So literate culture in Norway became increasingly Danish as the years went by. After the introduction of absolutism, Norway, just like Denmark, was governed from the capital, Copenhagen, and all local officials were appointed by the king. Culture, politics, education, and everything else was dominated by Copenhagen. Norway was ruled by the governor, appointed by the king. The kings themselves usually only made a brief visit for formally introducing themselves in Norway at the beginning of their reigns. One of the few exceptions was actually Christian IV, who had taken a genuine interest in Norway and visited no fewer than 25 times. And not just to Oslo, which he renamed Christiania after himself. He sailed all the way to North Cape in northernmost Norway, using the far from convincing alias Christian Fredriksson. As I've mentioned already, following the Treaty of Copenhagen in 1660, Norway retrieved the middle bit around Trondheim that had been lost to Sweden in 1658. Still, the Danish crown had lost some juicy bits of real estate east of the Öresund, and not everyone was willing to let go of Scania and these other provinces just like that. Next time, we'll see what they did to try and reclaim them. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.